The morning they led the first goat through the gate, a rooster somewhere in the county seat was still deciding whether to bother, and the mist lay so thick across those 70 acres that a person standing at the fence could not see the far tree line at all. What they could see, if they looked carefully, was Marin Shawl, 24 years old, wearing her dead father's canvas coat, her dark hair pinned back with what appeared to be a finishing nail, walking straight into that wall of gray-green tangle as though she owned the place, which, as of 11 days prior, she did. She had paid $61.40 at the county tax sale for 70 acres of land so thoroughly strangled by wild grape, sumac, and briars that the assessor's office had stopped assigning it a category and simply written in the parcel notes words that translated to "not worth the ink." 2 springs later, those same 70 acres would feed a town. But that morning nobody knew that yet, and the goat, a Roman-nosed, yellow-eyed Toggenburg doe Marin had traded 3 days of harvest labor to acquire, planted all 4 hooves in the grass, and refused to move. Marin looked at her. The goat looked back. Then Marin said, quiet and level, the way she said most things, "You and I are going to understand each other before long." She picked up a handful of the vine and held it to the doe's lips. The goat ate it. And then, because goats are not complicated creatures when their interest is engaged, she walked forward into the tangle and did not stop. That is how it began. That is the whole logic of it, if you want to look for one. A young woman, a reluctant goat, and land that everyone in Harrow County agreed was good for nothing but rusting away. 3 years earlier the land had belonged to a man named Gideon Peel, who had meant to farm it and had instead died of a burst appendix before he ever broke ground. His heirs had neither the will nor the proximity to work it, and so the county had sat on the taxes, patient as a creditor always is when it senses a sure thing, and eventually the parcel had come to sale. Most of the men at the auction had arrived the way people arrive at curiosity, interested but not committed. They looked at the description in the clerk's hand-lettered ledger, they looked at each other, and then one by one they stepped back. 70 acres of riparian bottomland, the description said. But what the description did not say was that a hard flood 6 summers prior had deposited a moving wall of seed across the entire parcel, and in the years since, the wild grape alone had climbed every fence post, every elm, every standing thing, until the old Peel place looked less like farmland and more like a fever dream of green roping itself into knots. Marin Shawl had been standing at the back of the auction room when the bidding reached $40 and stalled. She had $63 to her name, earned dollar by slow dollar over 3 years of hired work, first in a tannery, then in a hotel kitchen, then in the fields of every neighbor, willing to pay a fair wage. She had been saving it the way people save who do not know what they are saving for, only that they will need it and that it will be right when it comes. She stood in the back of that room and she thought about the vine. She thought about what she knew that the men at the front of the room did not seem to know, which was that wild grape grew best in rich, alluvial bottom soil, which meant the soil itself was deep and loose and dark and hungry. She thought about goats, which her grandmother had kept, and about what goats did to a tangle if you let them. She thought about the creek that bisected the parcel, which the county map showed running year-round. She thought about all of this for approximately 45 seconds. Then she bid $61.40, which was every cent she had, less 2 cents she kept deliberately in her coat pocket because she had promised herself she would never be entirely broke, and she said it in a clear voice that made the room turn around to look at her. The auctioneer blinked. Nobody else raised a hand. He struck the block, and that was that. The man standing beside her, a grain dealer named Aldous Ferry, who had not bid but clearly felt he had some claim to an opinion, looked at her with something between pity and contempt and said, "Young lady, you'd have done better to sleep in the street. At least the street doesn't cost you $60. Marin put the receipt in her coat pocket next to the 2 pennies and said nothing at all. Being right, she had learned early, is its own kind of reply. There was a neighbor to the north of the parcel, an old man named Pavel Sidor, who had emigrated from somewhere in the Carpathian foothills 40 years prior, and who had watched every piece of land in Harrow County go through its seasons the way a reader watches characters in a familiar book. He grew a meticulous kitchen garden, kept 2 cows, and spoke English with a cadence that turned every sentence into something close to a proverb. He came to the fence on the 3rd morning after the sale, leaned on the top rail, and watched Marin pulling vine off a fence post with her bare hands because she had not yet acquired a good hook. "You know what they say about the ground that nobody wants," he said. "What do they say?" Marin said without stopping. "They say it is resting." He let the silence sit for a moment. "My grandfather kept goats, on land very much like this. Rocky, choked. They said it was ruined. He said, 'Give it to the goats for 2 years, and it will beg you to plant it.'" He tapped the fence post. "The vine is not your enemy. The vine is just eating the wrong thing. You change what it eats on." Marin straightened up and looked at him. "How many goats?" she said. "How much land?" he said. 70 acres, maybe 40 of it heavy vine." Pavel tilted his head and looked at the sky in the way old men with long knowledge look at the sky when they are not looking at the sky at all, but at a number. 20 goats, he said. No fewer, 2 years of hard browse, and then you disc it once, deep, and the soil will be so open it will break your heart with gratitude. Marin had 1 goat. She did not say that. She said, "Thank you," and went back to pulling vine. But she thought about the arithmetic all the way through that afternoon and well into the night, lying in the rented room above the Ferry Road Tavern that she'd been sleeping in for $4 a month. 1 goat acquired by labor. She needed 20. She had no money. She had land. Land that could not be used for anything until the vine was gone, and the vine could not go without the goats. And the goats cost money she did not have. It was the kind of circle that defeated most people. Marin lay on her back in the dark and turned it slowly, the way you turn a lock when you feel the mechanism but haven't found the number yet. By morning, she had it. She spent the following 3 weeks doing what she had always done, hired work. She took every job available within a half-day's ride of Harrow County. She stacked lumber. She whitewashed 3 buildings. She helped a widow named Greta Fassbauer put up 40 quarts of preserved tomatoes in exchange for 2 young does, not yet a year old but sturdy and opinionated in the way young does tend to be. She dug a drainage channel for a feed merchant who paid her in coin, and with that coin she bought 3 more does at a livestock sale in the next county, where a farmer with too many animals and a sick wife was selling cheap and quickly. She traded a week of fence mending for $1. By the end of the 3rd week of October, she had 8 goats, no money, and a plan. She moved them onto the parcel on a Tuesday. The town of Harrow saw this. The town of Harrow had opinions. Aldous Ferry, who ran the grain dealership from a false front building on the main square and who had appointed himself the unofficial assessor of other people's ambitions, told anyone who would listen that Marin Scholl had spent her last dollar on a parcel of weed and was now adding insult to injury by filling it with goats, which were, in his considered view, the stupidest animals God put breath into. A woman named Carlotta Breach, who kept the post office and therefore knew everything about everyone without technically violating any confidence, reported that several of the established farmers had taken to riding past the Peel parcel on their evening constitutionals just to observe the situation and confirm their low expectations. Marin knew they were looking. She did not alter her pace. What she did was work. Every morning before the sun committed to rising, she was on the parcel. She had built, from salvaged lumber and the broken rails of the original Peel fencing, a series of movable browse panels, simple frames, strung with wire that she could reposition to concentrate the goats on a particular section of vine, then move on when the browse was exhausted. It was slow and physical, and there were days when the panels refused to stay set in the wet clay, and the goats found the weak point in every temporary fence, with a speed and cleverness that bordered on the vindictive. But the vine came down. A little at a time, section by section, the vine came down. Pavel Sidor came to the fence every week or so and watched. Sometimes he brought things, a better wire hook for pulling grape, a bundle of dried herbs from his wife for whatever Marin was cooking over her small fire at noon. He said very little. He had the quality of silent presence that very experienced people sometimes have, where their being near is itself a form of instruction. In December, when the vine had died back for the winter and the goats had stripped a good 8 acres down to bare reddish clay, Marin walked those 8 acres alone one afternoon and pressed her boot heel into the earth. It sank an inch. She pressed again. An inch and a half, maybe 2. She dug up a handful and crumbled it, and the smell that came up was the smell of ground that had been holding its breath for years and was just now exhaling, rich, deep, alive. She banked that knowledge the way she banked everything, quietly, behind her face, where nobody else could spend it. She also, that same December, acquired a child, not in any formal sense. The child in question was a boy of about 11 named Cillian, who belonged to a family of tenant farmers 2 parcels to the east, and who had taken to appearing at the fence of the Peel place after school with the air of someone who has decided, without quite announcing it, that they live here now. He was spare and grave and extraordinarily interested in the goats, whom he had named, all 8 of them, within his first week of attendance, despite the fact that Marin had not named them and had not asked him to. He called the oldest doe Henrietta, for reasons he declined to explain. He called the buck something unpronounceable that he said was a word from a book, and that may or may not have been true. Marin let him come. She let him help. And somewhere in that first gray winter, without ceremony, Cillian became a fixture of the place the way a good fence post becomes a fixture. You stop noticing when it arrived and start noticing only if it's gone. He was the one who found the stones. It was February, and they were moving the browse panels to a new section of the eastern 40 when Cillian's boot caught on something under the vine, and he went down. He was not hurt, but when they pulled back the matted grape that had covered the ground there, they found the top course of a wall, dressed limestone blocks, fitted without mortar, the kind of patient, careful stonework that takes a serious man a serious amount of time. They followed the wall. It went 8 feet north, turned a corner, went 12 feet east, turned again. A room. A small building buried entirely in vine and soil creep and the settled debris of decades. Marin stood at the center of what the cleared space revealed, a low stone structure, roofless but intact on 3 walls, the 4th collapsed inward, and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Cillian. "What is it?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. It was Pavel Sidor who knew. He came the next morning and walked the perimeter of the stones and then pulled a thick length of old iron from the collapsed wall, a bar of a kind that is bolted across a door. And he looked at it and said, "This is a jail." He said it without drama, the way he said most things. The old land claims, before the county seat moved, the magistrate's office was on this parcel. This would be, he did the arithmetic in his head, 60, maybe 65 years old. He set the bar down. Good stone, very good stone. A man does not put this stone down poorly. Marin thought about what a roofless stone room in the center of her land could become if a person applied patience and salvaged lumber and time. She thought about what a covered stone room stayed cool through in summer. She thought about what you could store in a space that stayed cool, that was dry, that was stone. She thought about all of this and said nothing about it to anyone, and she went back to moving the browse panels. By the following October, the 2nd October on the land, she had 19 goats. She had the original 8 plus the births of the first spring, minus 1 doeling lost to a fox in April, that she did not speak of to anyone because the grief was private and not something she intended to put on display. 19 goats, 40 acres cleared to bare-worked clay with that second inch of give that Pavel had predicted, and she had dissed it once, deep, behind a borrowed team, and the soil had opened like a book being read for the first time. She had also quietly, and over the course of 18 months, repaired the stone jail. She had salvaged roof timbers from a collapsed outbuilding on the Sidor land that Pavel had given her freely, glad to see them used. She had laid a puncheon floor inside the stone walls. She had built shelves. She had fitted a door with wooden hinges, strong and close-fitting. And then, in October, when the nights dropped below 40 degrees and the stone held the cold as stone does, faithful and deep, she had begun to fill the room with wheels of pressed goat cheese. She had been making cheese for 6 months. That had been Pavel's wife's instruction, a woman named Bozena, who appeared at the peel parcel one morning in April, carrying a copper pot and a length of cheesecloth, and who said, in approximate English, that if Marin had that many goats and was not making cheese, she was wasting the best part of the animal. She was not wrong. Marin learned fast. She had always learned fast. It was the trait that had kept her employed in 4 different trades before the age of 22, and within a few weeks she could produce a clean, firm wheel that pressed true and held its shape through the aging, with a rind that developed a pale gold blush, and a center that was smooth and cool and faintly sharp, in the way good goat cheese is faint and sharp, the way early autumn air carries something in it you can nearly name. She kept the cheese coming for 6 months before she let anyone outside the Sidor household know it existed. She stacked wheel after wheel in the stone room, aging them on the shelves in the cool dark. Pavel tasted the first wheel in May and set it down and looked at her. "You will be rich," he said. "I'll be all right," Marin said. "Same thing," said Pavel, and he was smiling. The town of Harrow did not know about the cheese. Aldous Ferry did not know about the cheese. Carlotta Breach at the post office, who knew most things, did not know about the cheese. Cillian knew, because Cillian was always there, and you could not hide a copper pot and 40 wheels of cheese from a child who had decided he lived on your land. But Cillian, whatever his other qualities, was not a talker. He named every goat and kept his own counsel. What broke the secret was an accident, as most secrets are broken. A man came through Harrow County in the 2nd November on his way from Cincinnati to Kansas City, a provisions buyer for a hotel company, a compact, precise man named Everett Slade, who was in the habit of stopping in small towns to assess whether any local producer might supply the hotels along his route. He had no particular reason to stop at the Peel parcel, except that his horse threw a shoe on the ferry road directly in front of the gate, and while he waited for his driver to walk back to the county seat smithy, he stood at the fence and looked across those 70 acres and saw the goats moving in the winter-brown pasture, 19 of them grown sleek and substantial, and the stone building with the close-fitted door, and the woman in the canvas coat, who was doing something at a fence post, and who did not stop working when he spoke to her. He asked what she was keeping. She said goats. He asked if she sold any product from the goats. She looked at him for a moment, the look of someone calculating not the answer, but whether to give it. And then she opened the door of the stone building and let him in. He tasted 3 wheels, in the way that buyers taste, methodically, seriously, without expression. Then he bought 7 wheels on the spot at a price Marin named quietly and without apology, a fair price, but not a cheap one, a price that assumed the buyer knew what he was holding. He paid it without argument. Then he pulled a card from his coat and told her that he purchased for 11 hotels and that his return route would bring him back through Harrow County in 8 weeks, and that he hoped she would have more wheels ready. She had 22 wheels ready when he came back. He bought all of them. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. This is a truth about towns, and it is a truth about people. And Harrow County was not exceptional in either direction. The town began to notice the 2nd November. A wagon coming out of the Peel place in the early morning headed for the ferry road, carrying something under canvas that was not hay and was not lumber. Aldous Ferry noticed. Carlotta Breach noticed. The riding farmers noticed. And because Harrow County was, beneath its mockery, a town of people who responded to demonstrated success the way dry ground responds to the first good rain, rapidly and with a kind of relief, the town began slowly to recalibrate. The mockery did not stop all at once. It never does. Ferry still referred to the goats as a comedy, but there was a new note in it, a note that Marin recognized as the sound of a man trying to hold a position he has already privately surrendered. Then came the summer, and with it the drought. It arrived in June, and it did not leave. By July, the creek levels across Harrow County were down by half. By August, the corn in the bottom fields that had been watered by the same creek systems that lace the county, was finished. Men who had planted 100 acres of corn were looking at a total loss. The hay fields burned to straw. Livestock prices collapsed because every farmer who could not feed his animals was selling them, flooding the market, driving the price to nothing. It was the kind of summer that breaks things, and it broke a great many things in Harrow County. But the Peel parcel, those 70 acres of alluvial bottomland that the assessor had not thought worth the ink, sat on the creek at its deepest bend, where the channel ran underground through a limestone shelf before it surfaced again, cool and undiminished. The creek on Marin's land did not drop by half. It dropped by an eighth. The old flood-deposited soil, deep and open from 2 years of goat browse and one deep dissing, held moisture at its roots through August and into September in a way that shallower tilled ground simply could not. The browse pasture stayed green when everything around it was the color of old rope. The goats, who preferred variety to abundance, and who had by now grazed the parcel into a diverse and managed browse, came through the summer in better condition than most of the cattle in the county. Marin did not gloat about this. She watched the sky the way Pavel watched it, and she counted what she had, and she laid in every bit of store she could against the possibility that August was not the worst of it. The worst of it arrived in the form of Aldous Ferry. He came to the Peel parcel on a Thursday morning in late August, when the air was the temperature of a slow oven and every loose thing in the county was coated in a fine pale dust. He came in his good coat, which was a signal Marin had learned to read. Aldous Ferry wore his good coat when he was conducting business he expected to win. He stood at the gate, and he said that given the general hardship of the season and the various losses being absorbed across the county, he thought it might be in her interest to consider an offer. He had, he said, a buyer in the city, a developer who was acquiring parcels along the creek for a planned mill operation, and he thought he might be able to obtain for her a fair price for the full 70 acres. He named the price. It was $140. Marin had, in her stone room, a cash box containing $311 from cheese sales since the previous November, with another delivery to Slade's Route contracted for September at a guaranteed price. She also had 19 goats, a cleared and opened parcel of deep bottomland, the only reliable creek surface in the drought-stricken county, and a structure that could age 100 wheels of cheese if she expanded the shelving by one additional row. She looked at Ferry. She said, "Thank you for coming out," and she went back to her work. He stood at the gate a moment longer, recalibrating. Then he said more slowly, "A woman alone is at a disadvantage in difficult times. You may find that holding on costs more than letting go." Marin set down the hook she was carrying and looked at him steadily. "Mr. Ferry," she said, "I've been in difficult times since before you knew my name. I find I manage." He left. He came back 2 weeks later with a higher offer, $200, and Marin met it with the same stillness. He did not come a third time. What did come in September was the hunger. It is worth saying plainly, the drought of that summer was not a disaster for Marin Shawl, but it was a genuine disaster for several families in Harrow County, including 2 tenant farming families on the parcels to Marin's east, including the family of the boy Cillian. They had lost their corn crop entirely and their kitchen garden to the heat. They were not starving, not yet, not quite, but they were the pale, careful kind of hungry that people become when they know the next meal is not certain, when they eat half of what they have and save the rest and do not talk about it at the table. Cillian came to the parcel one morning in September, and he worked beside Marin for 3 hours without saying anything, which was not unusual, but at noon, when she handed him his portion of bread and cheese, the kind of meal she ate every day, plain and generous, he ate it in a way that answered several questions. That evening, Marin took a wheel of cheese and a sack of dried provisions and walked east to the Cillian family's door. She did not make a speech. She did not frame it as charity, because it was not charity. It was a payment for 3 months of honest work from a boy who had named all her goats and fixed her browse panels and never once complained. She handed it through the door, and she said Cillian had earned it and she wanted him back on Tuesday. She did the same for the other tenant family and for the widow Fassbauer, who had given her the 2 does and the 40 quarts of preserved tomatoes 3 years prior, and who was now, at 71, sitting on a kitchen garden that had produced almost nothing. She did not advertise this. She did not want Ferry to know she had surplus, because she had not entirely finished dealing with Ferry, and information in the hands of the wrong man has a way of traveling. But Carlotta Breach, who ran the post office and knew everything, knew this too, eventually. And in a small county, what Carlotta Breach knew became, with great efficiency, what everyone knew. The cheese came to the table at the county seat's most respectable boarding house in October, the same week that Everett Slade's wagon rolled back through Harrow County for the 3rd time. Slade had brought a colleague with him on this trip, a man who ran provisions for a restaurant in Cincinnati, a broad-shouldered man named Hatch, who put a bite of the pale gold wheel in his mouth and sat very still for a moment, and then said, "How much of this does she have?" She had 31 wheels at that moment and a standing order from Slade's hotels. Hatch offered a price that was, to be precise, 40% higher than what Slade was paying. He named it briskly, with the confidence of a man who expected the number to close the conversation. Marin listened. She told him plainly that she had an existing arrangement with Mr. Slade and that she honored her arrangements. But she would be expanding production through the winter, and she would contact him in the spring about additional supply at a fair price, at which point he could name a number, and she would name a number, and they would find the place where those numbers agreed. Hatch blinked. He had not expected to be managed. He said that was acceptable, and he ate another bite of cheese. And he did not look like a man who was going to wait patiently until spring, but who understood that the woman across from him was not going to be hurried. Slade, who had witnessed this exchange, caught Marin's eye after Hatch had gone out to the wagon and said with a small, dry amusement, "You knew he was coming with me." "I had a reasonable guess," Marin said. "How?" "You wrote that your return route had a variance. You wouldn't take a variance unless you were combining the trip with something or someone." Slade shook his head once, the way people shake their heads at a thing they should have accounted for. "You're going to do very well," he said. "I intend to," said Marin. The thing about Ferry came to its conclusion in November, which was when the county assessor arrived at the Peel parcel with new paperwork and the information that the parcel had been reevaluated, and the property taxes were being adjusted upward substantially to reflect the improved productivity of the land. The new annual tax figure was 3 times the prior amount and was due in full before the 1st of January. Marin looked at the figure. She had $208 in the cash box at that moment, with a delivery payment from Slade due the following week, enough that she could pay the new tax and still keep the farm liquid, if she was careful, which she was always careful. But she looked at the paperwork more carefully, because she had always been careful with paperwork, and she noticed that the reevaluation had been requested not by the assessor's office on its own initiative, but had been filed by a third-party petition, which the assessor was required by county procedure to disclose. The name on the petition was Aldous Ferry. A petition required a stated interest. Ferry's stated interest, on the form, was that he was acting as agent for a prospective purchaser of the property who needed a current valuation. This was a legal mechanism, and it was being used legally, but it had a procedural vulnerability that Marin understood because she had, in the 3 years since she arrived in Harrow County, made a point of reading the County Procedures Handbook, which was a thing that nobody else in the county had apparently found worth their time. A third-party petition for reassessment, if it resulted in an increased tax burden that the property owner challenged, required the petitioning party to appear before the county board and justify the petition on grounds of public benefit. It was a provision designed for contested estate situations, and it had almost certainly never been used in Harrow County in living memory. But it was in the handbook, on page 41. Marin filed the challenge on a Monday morning. The county board met on the following Thursday. Ferry arrived in his good coat. He arrived with what he clearly expected to be a brief and decisive proceeding, because the board was composed of 3 men who knew him and had done business with him, and because the woman filing the challenge was, in his estimation, alone. She was not alone. She had Pavel Sidor, who arrived in his good coat as well, and who sat beside her and said nothing during the proceeding, but whose presence in that room communicated something that words would have diluted. She had Greta Fassbauer, who was 71, and who sat in the back of the room with her hands folded, and whose history in the county was longer than anyone else's, and whose opinion carried the kind of weight that age and consistency produce in a community. She had Cillian's father, who was a tenant farmer, and who had no great power in Harrow County, but who was there and who was visible. She had, in her hands, the County Procedures Handbook, open to page 41. She spoke for 11 minutes. She did not attack Ferry directly. She described the parcel, the history of the tax sale, the work that had been done, and the procedural requirement that a third-party petition justify itself on grounds of public benefit. She asked the board, quietly and without theater, to explain to her what public benefit had been served by a petition that appeared to have been filed by a man with a stated commercial interest in depressing the current owner's capacity to hold the land. The board looked at Ferry. Ferry's good coat did not help him. He said he had acted within his rights as a county property agent. Marin said that was true and that she was not disputing his right to file, but asking the board to exercise their right to evaluate the petition's stated basis. This was, she said, simply the procedure. She said it plainly. She said it without triumph in her voice, which was the most devastating way to say it. The board deliberated for 20 minutes and returned the tax assessment to its prior figure on the grounds that the petition had not demonstrated sufficient public benefit to justify the reassessment at that time. They did not censure Ferry. They did not need to. The room had heard everything, and the room would remember. Ferry walked out of the county building into the cold November air, and he did not look at Marin as he passed. She did not look at him either. She was putting the handbook back into her coat pocket, next to the 2 cents she still kept there, and she was thinking about whether 35 wheels in the stone room was enough for the Slade delivery, or whether she needed to push production in the next 2 weeks. Pavel Sidor walked beside her to the street. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was about to say something that mattered. Then he said, "You know what they say about the ground that nobody wants." Marin said, "Tell me again." "They say it is resting," he said. "But a person who knows ground knows that resting is not the same as empty." He looked at her, his old Carpathian face steady and content as settled stone. "You are not empty. You were resting. Now you are not." She thought about this for a moment. "Your grandfather's goats," she said. "Did the land do what he said it would?" "Better," said Pavel. "It always does better than the person who works it expects, if the person who works it is patient and honest with the ground. She walked back to the peel parcel in the cold and the early dark, and when she opened the gate and the goats came to meet her, all 22 of them, Cillian's ridiculous names written invisibly on each one, she stood in the middle of them for a moment and felt the solid weight of the place around her. The browse pasture, cleared and working, the deep alluvial soil resting now through winter but holding everything it would give in the spring, the stone jail full of pale gold wheels in the dark, aging quietly toward value, the creek running cold and clear along its limestone bed, reliable as a kept promise. She went inside and lit the lamp and opened the ledger and did the arithmetic the way she always did, line by careful line. What she had, what she owed, what was contracted, what was possible. The numbers added to something that would have made the room at the county tax auction go completely silent if those men had known. They did not know, but they were beginning to guess, and their guessing had the quality of people who have revised their opinion of a piece of ground and are trying to revise it quietly enough that no one will remember they were wrong. The following spring, she hired Cillian's father to help her expand the cheese cellar. She brought in 3 more does. She planted 3 acres of kitchen garden in the open soil, the same open soil the goats had worked for 2 hard years. And the garden came up so dense and dark and abundant that Cillian stood at the edge of it in May and said, with the gravity of an 11-year-old encountering a mystery, "I didn't know dirt could do that." "It isn't dirt," Marin said. "It's land. There's a difference." By June, she had supplied 30 wheels to Slade's Route, 12 to Hatch's Restaurant Contact in Cincinnati, and sold another 8 directly to the boarding house in the county seat, where the same men who had watched her bid $61.40 on a worthless parcel were now eating her product at their supper tables and saying that the cheese from the old Peel place was something quite remarkable, had been remarkable all along, a hidden gem of the county, really, if you had known where to look. Marin heard this. She allowed herself a private fraction of amusement. Then she went back to work. There is a thing that happens to land that is seen accurately by someone patient enough to wait and stubborn enough to work. It opens. It gives back everything it was holding. Not all at once and not without cost, but reliably and without deception, which is more than can be said for most things. The old Peel place, those 70 acres that the assessor had not thought worth the ink, that the men at the auction had looked at and stepped back from, that Aldous Ferry had tried 3 separate times to pry from the hands of the young woman who had seen what he had not. The old Peel place opened itself completely in that second spring. The browse pasture carried 22 goats easily and would carry more. The kitchen garden produced past what one woman could put up, past what the Cedar household could take, past what the 3 families to the east could use. The stone room aged its cheese in the dark and the cold, faithful as the limestone it was built from. Pavel came to the fence on a morning in late June when the vetch and clover in the cleared pasture were so green they looked painted, and the goats were moving through them with that deep contentment that well-kept animals have, and he leaned on the rail and looked out at it for a long time. "My grandfather would have understood this," he said at last. "What would he have said?" Marin asked. Pavel considered. "He would have said that the land does not lie, that it only speaks to the people who are willing to hear something they were not expecting." He paused. "He would have said that most people are not willing." Marin looked out at the 70 acres, at the cleared and working land, at the goats, at the stone room with its close-fitted door, at the creek running green-banked and clear in the morning light. She thought about $61.40 and the 2 pennies in her coat pocket and the look on the room's face when she'd raised her hand. She thought about all of it, the vine and the browse panels and the cold February morning when Cillian's boot had caught on a buried stone wall and they had pulled back the mat of dead grape and found the old jail underneath, patient and intact, waiting for someone who would know what to do with a cool, dark room full of honest stone. Most people aren't, she agreed. And then she picked up the hook and went back to work, because there was always more work, and because the land, her land, bought for $61.40 when no one else would have it, rewarded, above all things, the willingness to begin again each morning and believe in what was not yet visible. It always does better than you expect if you are patient and honest with the ground.